There is a moment, barely perceptible, when physical intimacy transcends the skin and becomes something else entirely. A pause, a breath, a glance, and suddenly, the body is no longer just a body, but a language of the soul. He once believed touch was just touch, that desire was merely biology. But something shifted. A subtle presence lingered after closeness. Not hers, his own, now laid bare. Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." In that fragile moment of intimacy, the unconscious spoke. It whispered truths not about her, but about him, his fears, his longing, his need to be seen. He realized that what unsettled him wasn't the vulnerability of the body, but of the self. Because when another sees you without judgment, not just your body, but your being, the soul begins to stir. And that awakening is both terrifying and holy. For many, physical closeness is the goal, but for him it became a mirror, not of perfection, but of hidden fragments of himself he'd long forgotten or denied. That night, wrapped in silence, he didn't feel victorious. He felt exposed, and it was in that quiet exposure that he took his first step inward. There are silences that scream, not from pain, not from fear, but from depth. He sat across from her in a dim-lit room, the air thick not with words, but with something older, denser. She didn't speak. Neither did he. And yet, something was exchanged. More than 1,000 conversations could offer. A look, a stillness, an unspoken acknowledgement that both were not here to impress, but to be. Jung once wrote, "Loneliness does not come from being alone, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important." But what if those things cannot be spoken? What if the only true communication is the kind that bypasses language entirely? That evening, silence became a presence. Not empty, but alive. It demanded no explanation. It didn't rush to fill the space with noise or comfort. It simply existed. And in its presence, he saw her. Not the version shaped by words or gestures, but the essence behind the form. He also saw himself. What do we fear in silence? Perhaps the collapse of the image we spend so long constructing. The quiet dismantles performance. It forces the truth to surface. The tremble beneath the confidence. The longing behind the smirk. The child within the man. There is no armor in silence, no refuge in noise, only exposure. But strangely, that exposure did not bring shame. It brought peace. In that room, time lost its usual rhythm. Minutes became landscapes, every breath a horizon. There was no need to explain joy, pain, or desire. The body was still, but the soul, it moved. He remembered moments from childhood, sitting alone beneath a tree, staring at the sky, the same kind of silence wrapping him like a blanket. Back then, he called it loneliness. Now, he saw it for what it was. Communion. What makes silence meaningful is not what it hides, but what it reveals. Not absence, but presence. It speaks to those brave enough to listen, and answers only those who ask nothing of it. By the time she left, no promises were made, no parting words exchanged. And yet, he felt changed. Not because of her, but because of what the silence revealed in him. There are few things in life more powerful than shared silence, and fewer still that shape a man as deeply. It wasn't just silence anymore. It was something denser. Solitude. Not the kind forced by circumstance, but the kind chosen, embraced. A deliberate stepping away from the world's noise. He had wandered far from the city, from its voices, from its mirrors. And now, surrounded by the stillness of an empty landscape, he began to hear the only voice that mattered, his own. There's a reason the ancients sought mountains and deserts. Solitude strips away illusion. It dissolves the masks worn to be seen, liked, accepted. What remains is raw, sometimes frightening, always honest. As Jung observed, your visions will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes. In solitude, he looked in. And what he saw wasn't heroic or perfect. It was fractured, weathered, but real. At first, he felt discomfort, the urge to distract, to scroll, to run back to something familiar. But there was no signal here, no escape, just the slow alchemy of stillness working on the mind. The first transformation wasn't glorious. It was humbling. He realized how much of his life had been lived for an audience. There were echoes inside him, memories he'd buried, truths he'd ignored. In solitude, they surfaced, not to haunt him, but to be held, forgiven, understood. He sat with them like old companions, not enemies, not regrets, just parts of himself, long exiled. There is no growth without confrontation, no maturity without reflection. Solitude offered him no answers, only the courage to ask better questions. What do I fear when I'm alone? What am I hiding from in the noise? Over time, the discomfort gave way to clarity. His thoughts, once frantic, now moved with intention. His breath slowed, his senses sharpened. He noticed the shape of trees, the color of shadows, the weight of silence at dusk. And in this noticing, something shifted. He realized that solitude wasn't a punishment. It was a mirror, one that didn't flatter, but didn't lie. One that showed not what he was supposed to be, but what he already was. He emerged not renewed, but realigned, less distracted, less desperate, more whole. The alchemy of solitude had begun its work, not by changing who he was, but by revealing him. He had returned from solitude changed, but the silence had only opened the door. What lay beyond was darker, heavier, more complex. It was not light he now sought, but the shadow. Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And so he descended, not outward, but inward, into those corners of himself he had long ignored, where resentment curled like smoke, where pride masqueraded as principle, where fear wore the mask of strength. The shadow is not evil. It is merely unlived life, potential turned bitter from neglect. He came to understand this not through thought, but through confrontation. The sudden memory of a lie, a look he avoided, a truth he suppressed. They rose in him without warning, like dreams remembered in the middle of the day. He did not resist them, not this time. Instead, he watched and listened. Each shadow had its story, each fault its root. He began to see how many of his actions, even the noble ones, had been driven by unseen motives: the need to be admired, the fear of being alone, the hunger for control. He was not unique in this, but he was, at last, honest about it. Reflection is not thinking, it is seeing, noticing without judgment, naming without shame. He realized that to carry the shadow consciously is not weakness, it is power. Only the man who knows his darkness can choose not to act from it. Only he who sees his capacity for cruelty can choose kindness freely. And here, something subtle happened. He stopped needing to prove, to justify, to be right. He understood that much of what he hated in others was a reflection of what he hadn't accepted in himself. The arrogance he condemned, the weakness he mocked, it all lived in him too. Acknowledging this did not break him, it humbled him. And that humility made him stronger. He began to notice the shadow in others, not to judge, but to recognize, to relate, to forgive. For the first time, compassion wasn't an effort, it was instinct. He emerged from the mirror room quieter, more grounded. The shadow was no longer an enemy, but an advisor, a reminder that he, like all humans, was complex, contradictory, unfinished. To walk with your shadow is not to be haunted. It is to be whole. He did not announce his return. There was no triumph in his step, no drama in his presence. He simply came back, changed, but not seeking recognition. And that was the difference. The world he left had not changed. The noise, the speed, the endless performing, it all continued as if nothing had shifted. But he moved through it differently now, not above it, not against it, but apart, as if a layer of illusion had been lifted. People sensed it, without understanding. Some were drawn closer, others pulled away. There was something in his eyes now, unapologetic stillness, a kind of silent refusal to play the old games. You may know this feeling too, when you've returned from an inner place others have never seen, when you carry silence in a room full of noise, when your presence unsettles, not because it is loud, but because it is no longer needy. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And so, without asking, he returned not to be what others needed, but to be who he had found. He no longer sought validation, not from success, not from affection, not even from being understood. That search had died somewhere in the wilderness of solitude and shadow. What remained was not pride, but clarity. He worked differently. He listened more than he spoke. He no longer rushed to fill the space with opinions, not because he didn't care, but because he saw how little of it truly mattered. What mattered now lived deep and quiet. He began to rebuild his life, not as a monument to ambition, but as a reflection of alignment. Fewer things, truer connections, a different rhythm. People asked what had changed. He had no answer that would satisfy. How do you explain that nothing outside shifted, but everything inside did? He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He simply lived. And that was the return, not to a place, but to a self he had once abandoned, a self that had waited patiently behind years of pretending. He understood now. You don't need permission to return, not from society, not from family, not even from your past. You only need to decide that the person you are becoming is more important than the person you were expected to be. And so he walked quietly into his own life. Finally, his. He stood at the edge of a familiar life, not torn between options, but anchored in clarity. There was no audience, no applause, no witness to the decision he was about to make, and yet it would define everything that followed. This choice wasn't sudden. It had taken root in silence, grown in nights where sleep would not come. It had shaped itself from the fragments of old dreams and new truths. And now, quietly, it asked to be honored. You may recognize this moment, when no one is watching, when there are no guarantees, and still, you must choose, not because it is expected, not because it is safe, but because the alternative is a return to self-betrayal. Carl Jung once said, "In each of us, there is another whom we do not know." He speaks to us in dreams and tells us how differently he sees us. This voice, the inner one, the buried one, had grown louder than the world's. He didn't choose success. He didn't choose rebellion. He chose integrity, the rarest form of freedom. He chose not to live divided, not to carry the weight of masks or roles that no longer fit. There was loss in this, a real one. Some people would turn away. Some opportunities would vanish. But what he would keep, what he would gain, was far more valuable. The alignment between his inner and outer worlds. He simplified, not out of asceticism, but out of clarity. The noise fell away. The distractions ceased to hold power. And in that absence, something luminous emerged. Peace. Not the kind of peace that avoids conflict, but the kind that no longer creates it. This choice, though quiet, reshaped him. He walked slower. He breathed deeper. He listened not only to others, but to the still voice beneath his thoughts. He no longer reacted. He responded. He no longer grasped. He offered. He no longer feared being alone, because he had learned to be whole. There was no ceremony, no ritual, just a man and a moment, and the sound of his own breath. And in that breath, the knowing. This is the path, not because it is easy, but because it is true. And now, perhaps, you are standing at the edge of your own silence. What choice will you make when no one is watching and everything is at stake? If this journey has spoken to something in you, consider subscribing and watching our previous films. Each one is a mirror, offering a glimpse of yourself, waiting to be remembered.